The moment she had dreamed of for years arrived dressed not in joy, but in a cold, unfamiliar silence, as though fate itself had paused to watch her heart tremble. She had envisioned her son's return as a healing embrace, a reunion where love would rise above every hardship. Yet what approached on that dusty road carried a darkness she could neither name nor escape. Long before his shadow reached her, something deep in her spirit whispered that this homecoming would leave her forever changed. Mama Nena stood at the pathway leading into the village, a stretch of earth she had tended with prayers, tears, and unwavering hope, the sound of distant birds blending with the restless hush of evening. Her wrapper was worn from years of labor, but she held it with quiet dignity, smoothing it as though preparing herself to welcome the boy she had raised with every ounce of strength she possessed. For months she had polished this moment in her mind, imagining the warmth of his embrace, the smile of gratitude on his face, and the relief of knowing her sacrifices had built a future, brighter than any she could offer, within the village. She had told the neighbors proudly that her Darasimi would return a changed man, a successful man, a grateful son who remembered the hands that shaped him. But as a sleek car rolled toward her, its tinted windows reflecting nothing of the boy she once knew, Mama Nena felt a quiet unease settle into her bones. When the door opened and Darasimi stepped out, he did not glance toward her with recognition or longing. Instead, he straightened his jacket with an air of practiced confidence, the kind forged not from honor, but from ambition, sharpened by the city's relentless hunger. His eyes moved across the village with polite distance, as though he were greeting a place he had only heard about, not one that had cradled his childhood dreams. Mama Nena stepped forward, her voice soft with emotion as she called his name, but Darasimi hesitated before looking at her, his expression wavering between discomfort and reluctance. The city had wrapped him in an identity so fragile he feared even the wind might tear it away. When she stretched out her arms to embrace him, the gesture carried years of longing and the tenderness of a heart that had never stopped believing in him. But instead of returning the embrace, Darasimi stepped back with a subtle but unmistakable withdrawal, a small movement that struck with the force of a storm against her fragile hope. His eyes darted toward the neighbors who gathered nearby, and in that moment, he chose the image he had built over the mother who had built him. The villagers, usually warm and welcoming, felt an unfamiliar tension ripple through the air. Some lowered their gazes in discomfort, others exchanged quiet glances, but no one dared to speak. Mama Nena felt the weight of their presence pressing against her pride, yet her heart beat not with shame for herself, but with sorrow for her son. She sensed the city had swallowed him whole, and returned a version of him that could not recognize the home that shaped him. Still, she forced a smile, steadying her breath as though willing herself to believe that this moment was simply a misunderstanding, a hesitation that love could still polish back to tenderness. Darasimi walked ahead without reaching for her hand, his steps brisk, almost impatient, as though afraid of being stained by the simplicity of the land that raised him. Mama Nena followed slowly, her spirit bruised but trying desperately not to show it, for she believed that love, true love, required endurance even in the face of wounds that cut without warning. She replayed his arrival in her mind, searching for the son she once carried on her back through the fields, the child who would run into her arms after even the smallest absence. Yet all she found was an emptiness growing between them, a silent distance that no words could bridge. Still beneath her pain, she held on to a fragile thread of hope, telling herself that sometimes pride masks fear, and perhaps her son's heart was simply overwhelmed by the weight of his new life. She whispered a quiet prayer, asking fate to soften him, to guide his steps back to gratitude, and to give her strength to withstand the ache that now pressed against her chest. But as twilight deepened and the shadows lengthened, here, the relentless tide. In that moment, Darasimi made a silent vow to rise, no matter what part of himself he had to bury to do it. He began by crafting a version of himself that fit the city's appetite, a polished, self-assured man who claimed a childhood wrapped in comfort rather than hardship. He spoke of opportunities that never existed, of mentors he had never met, weaving narratives with the ease of someone who knew survival depended on convincing the world he belonged. The more he told these stories, the more they became second nature, slipping from his tongue without hesitation, shaping the contours of a man unrecognizable to the boy his mother once carried on her back. Yet Lagos did not offer acceptance freely. It tested him in ways only the ambitious understood. He learned to navigate boardrooms where every smile carried an agenda, and every handshake concealed layers of unspoken competition. He adapted quickly, mimicking the confidence of those who had walked this path before him, adopting their mannerisms, their phrases, even their silent arrogance. But beneath the refined exterior he displayed to the world, a quieter conflict brewed, one that tugged at him during late nights when the city lights dimmed and the hum of traffic softened into distant echoes. In those moments, he felt the pull of home like a whisper pressing against the edges of his mind, reminding him of the soil he had abandoned. Still, the allure of Lagos was fierce, and Darasimi allowed the city to wrap itself around him like a second skin. He relished the attention he received from executives who praised his intelligence, from social elites who admired his poise, and from influential circles that welcomed him without questioning where he had come from. Whenever he laughed with them over glasses of imported wine or exchanged strategic compliments under crystal chandeliers, he felt an intoxicating rush, the quiet victory of someone who had outgrown the limits of his past. But beneath the luxury, there remained an ache he refused, a tension that, binding him some nights, struggled to silence the uneasy feeling that his carefully built identity rested on ground far less solid than he pretended. Then, one evening, as he prepared to step into yet another gathering of polished faces, his phone buzzed with a message that stopped his breath. A message from an unknown sender bearing only a few words that pierced straight through his carefully crafted world. Someone, somewhere, had seen through the persona he wore so confidently, and the truth he had buried so deeply had finally begun to stir. In the quiet of her lonely hut, where the wind whispered through cracks in the walls and memories settled like dust on forgotten shelves, Mama Nena fought a war against a sorrow she never invited. Every night she tried to stitch her heart back together with threads of faith, but the weight of her son's absence pressed harder with each fading sunset. Long before illness touched her body, grief had already begun claiming pieces of her spirit. The village often moved with the same rhythm it always had, market chatter rising with the dawn, goats bleating near compounds, distant children laughing as they played in open fields. But inside Mama Nena's modest hut, time no longer felt the same. It had slowed into something heavy, something that clung to her like the lingering scent of rain before a storm. Each day she defended Darasimi's absence with a loyalty that astonished even those who loved her most. She insisted that he was busy with responsibilities beyond the village's imagination, that the demands of success often pulled a man in many directions, leaving little room for visits home. She painted him as a dutiful son navigating a world that required strength, discipline, and endless sacrifice, even though deep inside she feared she no longer knew the path he walked. At dusk, when the golden light dimmed and shadows lengthened across the clay floors, Mama Nena lit her kerosene lamp with a tenderness reserved for sacred rituals. The flame flickered softly against the hut's mud walls, casting moving shapes that reminded her of the boy Darasimi once was, playful, curious, and unbroken by the ambitions that now consumed him. She sat beside the small wooden table, her hands clasped tightly as she whispered prayers into the stillness, asking for protection, wisdom, and mercy over her son. She prayed not for wealth or recognition, but for his heart to remain intact, for the child she once carried to recognize that humility was the anchor holding a soul in place. Some nights, exhaustion settled into her bones so deeply that she could barely lift her hands in prayer. Yet she continued with quiet resilience. Her health had begun to shift in ways she tried desperately to ignore. Her breathing felt heavier, her steps slower, and her appetite weaker. But she attributed these changes to age, refusing to acknowledge that heartbreak could thread itself into the body, wearing it down from within. She often touched her chest as though trying to steady the ache pulsing beneath it, an ache she never allowed anyone to see fully. When sleep refused to come, her mind drifted across memories of Darasimi's childhood, moments preserved with a clarity sharper than the present. She remembered the sound of his laughter echoing through their compound, the way he clung to her wrapper when frightened by storms, and how he used to whisper dreams into her ears, dreams of growing, learning, and becoming someone the world could not ignore. Those memories warmed her even as they wounded her, reminding her of a version of him that felt painfully distant now. The child who once sought comfort in her arms had become a man who fled from the truth of where he came from. Despite the heavy sadness that settled inside her hut, Mama Nena forgave him quietly, even before he asked. Forgiveness had never been a transaction to her. It lived in the folds of her spirit, shaped by years of nurturing, sacrifice, and unconditional love. But forgiveness did not erase the ache. In fact, with each passing day, the ache deepened like a well that refused to fill. She masked it with gentle smiles when neighbors visited, telling them he was progressing well in the city and that his future was unfolding just as she had prayed for. Yet when she was alone again, the truth lingered in her chest like a fading ember, burning slowly but steadily. The nights grew longer, and the silence surrounding her grew heavier, settling into corners of the hut where hope once lived. She often stepped outside under the cool night air, lifting her face to the moon as though seeking answers hidden in its quiet glow. The village slept around her, but her thoughts refused rest, drifting back and forth between longing and fear, love and uncertainty. What pained her most was not that her son had forgotten her, but that he seemed to have forgotten the values she raised him with, values meant to guide him even as the world expanded before him. Still, she carried on. She tended her small farm, shared gentle wisdom with children who passed by her home, and found strength in knowing that love, even when tested, remained an anchor she refused to release. Yet beneath the surface of her composure, something fragile continued to crack, marking the slow unraveling of a woman whose heart was breaking quietly. But on a morning when the air felt unnaturally heavy and the birds sang with an unfamiliar tone, a neighbor approached her hut with hesitant steps and eyes clouded by troubling knowledge. He carried news from the city, news that struck the ground between them like an omen, and as he spoke her son's name, a chill slid through her spirit, warning her that whatever awaited her would change everything. The night he believed would cement his place among the elite unfolded with a brilliance so intoxicating it blinded him to the cracks in the foundation beneath his feet. It was meant to be a celebration of his triumph, yet beneath the glittering lights, a silent shift began, one that threatened to unravel everything he had built. Long before the whispers reached him, the room itself seemed to sense the truth he had hidden, waiting for the perfect moment to expose him. The gala had been the most anticipated event of the year, a night where the city's richest and most influential minds converged beneath a ceiling of crystal chandeliers and soft orchestral music that floated through the hall like a promise. Darasimi arrived dressed in a finely tailored suit, every stitch a testament to the persona he had crafted with meticulous care. As he stepped out of his car, cameras flashed, capturing his confident stride, the determined lift of his chin, and the assured smile of a man convinced his place among the elite was secure. The scent of expensive perfumes mingled with the warm hum of laughter, and for a brief moment, he felt invincible, as though the entire city bowed to his ascension. Inside, the hall shimmered with elegance, tables draped in gold, glasses raised in celebration, and the soft glow of candlelight made everything appear flawless. Darasimi navigated the room with practiced ease, shaking hands with executives, exchanging pleasant greetings with dignitaries, and offering polished remarks about his recent accomplishments. He spoke with a voice trained to sound refined, steady, and authoritative, weaving narratives that painted him as a man who had risen from privilege rather than perseverance. Each compliment he received fed the illusion he had wrapped around himself, lifting him higher into a world that rewarded confidence and punished sincerity. But beneath the surface of this dazzling night, something subtle began to shift. A tone in the laughter around him grew sharper, almost cutting. A glance held a second longer than usual, not with admiration, but curiosity. He felt it before he heard it, an invisible tightening in the air, like a thread being pulled quietly. While engaging in conversation near the banquet table, he noticed two men whispering behind their glasses, their eyes flicking in his direction. At first he brushed it off, telling himself that envy often accompanied success. But then another group murmured as he passed, and a faint unease crept into his chest, unsettling the confidence he had worn like armor. When someone casually mentioned rumors about his humble roots, the words slid through the hall with a weight that knocked something loose inside him. He tried to maintain his composed expression, but the rhythm of his heartbeat shifted, pounding with a force he could no longer ignore. His smile stiffened as he attempted to redirect the conversation, but the comment had already settled in his mind, echoing through every corner of the room. It felt as though the walls themselves were leaning closer, ready to crush the fragile lie he clung to. The music seemed to grow louder and sharper, no longer soothing, but overwhelming. The chandeliers, above, which moments earlier had appeared magnificent, now glimmered too brightly, their reflections striking his eyes like accusations. The hall felt smaller, the air heavier, and the faces around him, once sources of validation, had transformed into silent threats. He sensed the distant hum of a truth rising to the surface, a truth he had desperately hoped would remain buried beneath the glamour and prestige. He tried to steady his breath, reminding himself that Lagos respected power, not origin, and that he had built enough influence to withstand a few murmurs. But deep down, he knew that reputations in this world were brittle things, easily shattered by even the faintest tremor of scandal. As he moved through the room, attempting to regain his footing, he felt a gaze following him, steady, unwavering, and far more familiar than any of the polished faces surrounding him. He turned, expecting to see another elite, another businessman, or perhaps a journalist seeking a moment of attention. Instead, he found a shadow emerging from a dim corner of the hall, moving with a deliberate calm that made his chest tighten. The air shifted, the music seemed to fade, and in that suspended moment, the city's glamour could no longer shield him. The figure stepped closer, and before Darasimi could speak, a voice he had prayed never to hear again slipped through the noise, calling him by his true village name. It carried the weight of his buried past, spoken with a familiarity that shattered the illusion he had built. And as the sound settled into the hall, Darasimi felt his world begin to tilt. He had spent years burying the truth beneath polished words and expensive suits, never imagining it would rise again, covered in the dust he once walked barefoot. The city had shaped him into someone unrecognizable, yet the past approached with the unyielding calm of something too familiar to ignore. By the time he saw the man standing in the doorway, Darasimi understood that Lagos was not wide enough to hide a story written in the soil of home. The party was ending, but the lights of the city still poured through the tall windows, casting shimmering reflections across the marble floor. Darasimi had retreated into a quiet corridor, eager to escape the pressure of whispered rumors when a figure stepped into his path. At first, he assumed it was another elite wanting a conversation, or perhaps someone hoping to align with him for business. But the man standing before him held none of the refined posture or polished expression that filled rooms like this. His clothes carried the dust of long travel, the edges frayed by journeys meant for necessity, not luxury. And his eyes, steady, calm, seeing, held the weight of stories Darasimi had tried so hard to outrun. The man greeted him not with Sir or Mr. Darasimi, but with the name that belonged to the soil of his birth, the name spoken only by those who knew him before ambition reshaped his identity. It struck the air like a chisel against glass, sharp enough to fracture the illusion he'd spent years perfecting. For a heartbeat, Darasimi forgot the city, the suit, the reputation he clung to. He felt the world narrow into a single point where past and present collided with painful clarity. The man introduced himself as Chidubem, a longtime neighbor from the village, one who had watched Mama Nena raise Darasimi with a strength that outshined struggle. His presence felt like a stone placed on Darasimi's chest, heavy, uninvited, impossible to ignore. When Chidubem spoke of Mama Nena's declining health, each word landed like a quiet blow, not loud enough to attract attention, but strong enough to shake something hidden deep within him. She had grown weaker, the man said, not from age alone, but from a sorrow that had threaded itself into her bones, a sorrow fed by long nights waiting for a son who never returned. Yet even in her frailty, she had forgiven him fully, never allowing bitterness to stain her heart. A flicker of guilt surfaced in Darasimi, rising like a whisper from a part of himself he had muted for years. But guilt was dangerous in this world, dangerous because it brought vulnerability, and vulnerability threatened the identity he had built with such desperate precision. He forced the guilt down, burying it beneath layers of pride, fear, and the cold logic of survival. He told himself that returning to the past would only destroy everything he had achieved. He insisted, with carefully controlled breath, that the man should not speak of these things so openly, especially not here among people who respected him. But Chidubem was not swayed by polished excuses or the elegant setting around them. He stood firm, his gaze unwavering as he spoke of Mama Nena's resilience, her prayers, her quiet hope that her son would remember her before time carried her away. Darasimi felt the walls tightening again, but this time it was not the city's scrutiny that suffocated him. It was the weight of a truth he could not outrun. Still he dismissed Chidubem with a curt firmness, insisting he had urgent matters to attend to. The man studied him for a long moment, as though searching for the boy he once knew in the hardened lines of the man he had become. Before leaving, Chidubem delivered one final message, his voice steady, his words like a quiet prophecy. He reminded Darasimi that fate was patient, that unresolved debts traveled with those who refused to face them, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, remained alive beneath the surface. With that, he turned away, disappearing into the hall with the same calm certainty that had brought him there. Darasimi stood motionless, his breath shallow, the world around him suddenly distant. The city lights outside shimmered with deceptive beauty, yet he felt a strange unease rising within him, as though the night itself were shifting shape. He tried to brush off the encounter, convincing himself that one man's words could not disturb the foundation he'd built. But something inside him had been struck, softly, quietly, but undeniably. Later that night, as Lagos buzzed with its usual rhythm, the first photograph from his forgotten past appeared online with startling clarity. It spread faster than rumor, sharper than truth, carrying the unmistakable signature of a life he had sworn to erase. And as he had spent years building a world so polished, so carefully arranged, that he believed nothing could disturb its shine, until a single spark landed where he least expected. The night his past returned, it did not knock gently. It burst into the open with a force that exposed every fragile seam he had worked to conceal. And in the quiet moments before dawn, Darasimi realized that not even the brightest city lights could protect a man from the truth he abandoned. The first photograph that spread across the city's social circles emerged quietly, almost innocently, as though it had traveled on the softest breeze. But the image it carried struck with the precision of a blade, sharpened by time. It showed Mama Nena standing by her small vegetable stall at the village market, her wrapper faded, her smile tired but warm. The caption beneath it questioned the origins of the man who claimed to come from wealth. Within minutes, more photographs followed, images of the mud hut he once lived in, the narrow footpaths he walked barefoot as a child, the neighbors who remembered him with affectionate familiarity. These pictures stitched together the life he had desperately tried to erase. By morning, the city that once elevated him turned its spotlight into a weapon. Comments flooded every corner of social media, carrying tones of laughter, disbelief, and sharp judgment. People who had praised his brilliance now mocked him with quick conclusions and brutal certainty. They labeled him a fraud, a pretender who wrapped himself in stolen prestige, a man who craved admiration so deeply he lied to obtain it. The elites who once invited him to their gatherings distanced themselves with swift precision, as though the truth of his origins might stain their own reputations. Darasimi watched in disbelief as his influence crumbled at a pace he could barely comprehend. Business partners who had celebrated his ambition only days earlier withdrew their support, with carefully worded messages meant to protect their public image. Investors avoided his calls. Projects that once brimmed with promise were quietly paused, suspended in a limbo that revealed the fragility of his empire. It was as though the foundation beneath him had always been hollow, waiting for the right pressure to expose its emptiness. The city, which once felt like an ally, now loomed over him with an unforgiving coldness. Every corner he turned seemed to whisper of betrayal. Every face he passed seemed to recognize him, not as the polished man he presented, but as the child from the village he tried to forget. He felt the walls tightening around him, not from physical threat, but from the crushing awareness that he had built a life too fragile to withstand truth. The identity he forged, layer after layer of carefully constructed illusion, now trembled like a structure weakened by unseen cracks. In the quiet of his apartment, the silence felt heavy, thick with memories he had locked away. He replayed the long nights Mama Nena spent waiting for him, the warmth of her hands guiding him through hardship, the sacrifices she made without complaint. Each memory now rose like smoke from a fire he had set himself. He had turned away from the only person whose love was unconditional, all for the admiration of people who abandoned him at the first sight of imperfection. The weight of this realization settled into his spirit with a force that took his breath. For the first time since arriving in Lagos, he felt utterly alone. The friends he thought he had were nowhere to be found. The mentors he trusted avoided his presence with polite excuses. The city's bright towers, which once inspired dreams, now looked like monuments to a life built on shifting sand. And beneath all the noise of scandal, something deeper stirred within him, a quiet grief, a reflection he could no longer ignore. In his darkest moments, he stood before his mirror, looking at the man he had become. The reflection stared back with hollow eyes, stripped of pretense, confronted by the emptiness he had carried beneath the masks of ambition. It was not the scandal that shattered him, but the realization that he had betrayed the woman who raised him, the woman whose love remained constant even when he vanished into the city's shadows. And so, with the weight of failure pressing against his ribs, Darasimi made a decision he had feared for years. He would return to the village he betrayed. But as he packed his few belongings, a quiet dread crept into his chest, whispering that home might not welcome him as easily as he hoped. Still he boarded the bus, unaware that the road ahead would demand a price far greater than anything the city had taken from him. Hone buzzed relentlessly. Darasimi realized the past had finally opened its eyes. The road stretched before him like a silent witness, carrying the weight of choices he wished he could rewrite, each mile deepening the ache of shame lodged in his chest. He had boarded the bus seeking redemption, yet the closer he moved toward home, the louder his fears whispered that forgiveness might not wait for him at the end of the journey. And as the engine rumbled beneath him, he felt the past rise like a distant storm, ready to reclaim what he abandoned. Darasimi sank into the worn bus seat, the fabric warm from the travelers who passed before him, and stared through the dusty window as Lagos slowly unraveled behind him. The towering structures that once made him feel invincible now felt like monuments mocking his downfall. He watched them shrink into the distance, swallowed by the haze of morning light, and with each fading outline, the memories he fought so hard to escape resurfaced, raw, unfiltered, and painfully familiar. The bus jolted over uneven roads, yet none of the bumps unsettled him as much as the thoughts twisting in his mind. He had constructed an empire of illusion, but here, on this long road home, every lie felt heavier than the luggage resting by his feet. As the bus ventured farther, the landscapes began to change, shifting from concrete stretches to sprawling farms, from honking cars to open fields humming with quiet life. Each sight pulled at threads he had severed, unraveling the distance he had built between his origins and the man he became. He saw groups of children running barefoot along the roadside, their laughter rising freely into the breeze, and he felt a pang of longing, remembering a time when joy had required nothing more than soil beneath his feet and the warmth of his mother's voice calling him home. That simplicity seemed like a forgotten dream now, buried beneath layers of ambition and shame. He tried rehearsing apologies in his mind, shaping the words as though they might soften the edges of his regret. He imagined standing before Mama Nena, confessing everything he had done, admitting every moment he failed her. But each imagined apology collapsed beneath the weight of his guilt, sounding too small to mend the wounds he had caused. He touched his chest unconsciously, as though attempting to steady the unease pressing against his ribs, recognizing that the journey ahead demanded a humility he had never needed in the city. The bus made several stops along the way, allowing passengers to descend into nearby villages, but Darasimi remained seated, feeling increasingly like a stranger traveling toward a past he no longer deserved. As the journey stretched into hours, he found himself gripping the seat beneath him, bracing against the dread that whispered with every passing tree and every familiar bend in the road. The closer he moved toward home, the sharper the memories became. Days of laughter, nights of comfort, a childhood guarded by the unwavering strength of a mother who expected so little in return. By the time the bus finally reached his village, the sun hovered low above the horizon, bathing the earth in soft amber light that felt both welcoming and condemning. He stepped down, his legs trembling from more than the long ride. The air carried a stillness different from the city's restlessness, a calm that felt like a truth he could no longer avoid. As he began walking through the narrow paths, villagers emerged from their homes, their eyes widening with recognition. Some looked at him with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with the quiet accusation of those who knew the story he tried to bury. He felt their gazes follow him, scraping against his pride, reminding him that reputation meant nothing here. Only character did. He approached the family compound cautiously, each step weighted with memories of the boy he once was, a boy who believed home would always carry warmth for him. His heart thudded painfully as he neared the small gate, the scent of soil and the faint rustle of leaves stirring emotions he struggled to contain. This was the place where his journey began, and now it was the place he returned to learn whether he had any piece of that beginning left. With trembling hands, he pushed open the gate and stepped inside, bracing himself for the familiar voice he prayed to hear. But the compound greeted him not with warmth, nor with anger, only with a silence so absolute it chilled him to the bone. He called softly, then louder, his voice echoing against the empty walls. The hut, once alive with the sounds of his mother's gentle movements, stood eerily still, its doorway open like a breath paused mid-air. A cold realization wrapped around him as he stepped closer, sensing that the truth waiting inside would break him in ways the city never could. And in that suspended moment, the silence became a warning. The silence that met him inside the hut felt like a living thing, pressing against his chest with a heaviness that whispered of truths he was not yet ready to face. It was the kind of silence that carried memories, regrets, and unanswered prayers, echoing through the space where love once breathed freely. And before he could fully process it, a shadow of dread curled around his heart, warning that time had moved on without waiting for him. Darasimi stepped into the hut with the urgency of someone searching for a piece of himself long abandoned, his heartbeat echoing louder than his footsteps on the packed earth floor. The room, once familiar with the comforting scent of his mother's herbs and the soft rhythm of her daily routines, now stood still beneath a dim haze of dusk. Dust floated lazily through the thin shafts of evening light slipping in through the cracks, settling on the woven mats she once slept on. The calabash bowls he remembered from childhood sat undisturbed, their surfaces dulled by time, as though waiting for hands that would never return. He called out for her, his voice trembling with a desperation he had tried so hard to hide, but the air swallowed his words without offering a response. He moved quickly through the small space, touching the items she had left behind, the folded wrappers at the corner, the wooden stool she used when sorting vegetables, the old cooking pot still resting near the hearth. Each object bore the imprint of her presence, yet none held the warmth that had defined her existence. A strange chill filled the hut, and Darasimi felt it seep into his bones, awakening a fear he had not felt since childhood. In that moment, he realized how deeply he had wronged her, how long she had waited alone while he chased illusions in a world that celebrated everything except the truth. Footsteps approached from outside, and he turned to see an elderly neighbor standing at the doorway, his expression carrying a blend of sympathy and sorrow. The man stepped inside with careful hesitation, as though the air itself was heavy with unspoken grief. In a voice softened by age and understanding, he explained that Mama Nena had collapsed several days earlier. Her body, worn down by years of toil and heartbreak, had finally succumbed to exhaustion. The villagers had rushed to her aid, and when her breathing grew shallow and her strength faded, they carried her to the local healer in hopes that the herbs, chants, and ancestral blessings might restore her fading spirit. The words struck Darasimi with the brutal force of truth he had avoided for far too long. Shame washed over him, burning through every layer of pride he had built in the city. He tried to steady himself, but his legs felt weak, as though the ground beneath him was shifting. The realization of how deeply she had suffered, how long she had waited for a son who never returned, cut deeper than any judgment the city could deliver. His mother's love had always been unwavering, yet he had allowed distance and ambition to silence it until her strength began to disappear. He rushed outside, the air thick with the smell of approaching night, and began running toward the healer's home. Dust rose in clouds behind him, clinging to his clothes, settling into his hair, swirling around his feet like a physical embodiment of regret. His breaths came in uneven bursts, each inhalation carrying memories he had spent years trying to suppress. Her laughter as she prepared meals, her gentle guidance when he stumbled, the warmth of her hands as she soothed his childhood fears. Every memory pulsed through him with the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. The village path stretched before him, narrow but familiar, winding between tall shrubs and scattered huts. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the reddish earth, and the distant hum of evening insects blended with the rhythm of his hurried steps. He pushed himself forward, driven by a fear deeper than anything he had felt in the city, the fear of arriving too late. He imagined her lying fragile and quiet, her breath fading like a candle struggling against the wind, waiting for a son who may never reach her in time. The healer's compound finally came into view, marked by the faint glow of lantern light flickering against the fading sky. As he approached, he slowed, his chest heaving, his mind chaotic with dread and hope tangled together. But before he could step through the entrance, a sound drifted toward him, soft at first, then rising with mournful weight. It was a chant, low and rhythmic, carrying the sorrow of those gathered around a fragile thread of life. The chant deepened, echoing through the compound as though calling the ancestors to witness what came next. Darasimi froze at the doorway, sensing that the truth, awaiting him inside, would alter the course of his life forever. And with his heart trembling, he took the final step toward the unknown. In the dim glow of the healer's lantern, where shadows clung to the walls like mournful witnesses, the thin line between life and death trembled under the weight of a mother's final breaths. Every whisper of air she struggled to draw felt like a thread pulling her away, leaving Darasimi suspended in a terror he could neither escape nor undo. And as he stepped inside, the fragile quiet of the hut warned him that this moment might be the very one that defined the rest of his life. Darasimi entered the healer's hut with unsteady steps, the smell of herbs, smoke, and fading hope filling his lungs with a chill he would remember for years. The lantern's light flickered against the walls, revealing the fragile form of Mama Nena lying on a woven mat, her body curled slightly as though trying to shield itself from the cold grasp of impending departure. Her breathing came in shallow, uneven whispers, each one a reminder of the time he had squandered, each rise and fall of her chest a quiet plea he could no longer ignore. He knelt beside her, his knees pressing into the rough mat, and for the first time since boyhood, he felt utterly powerless, stripped of every illusion the city had given him. Her face, once vibrant with warmth and laughter, now looked fragile, her cheekbones sharper, her lips pale, her eyes closed tightly, as though holding on to the last threads of consciousness. Darasimi reached for her hand, trembling as he touched the skin that had once held him steady through storms. When his fingers wrapped around hers, he felt a chill that sank deep into his spirit, as if her body was already halfway across the threshold he feared. Emotion surged through him in a tide he could not contain, and he bent forward, his voice breaking as he whispered apologies he wished he had made years earlier. He spoke of regret, of shame, of the countless nights he had convinced himself he was too busy, too important, too afraid to return to her. The words flowed from him like a confession weighed down by sorrow, but he knew even as he spoke them that apologies had little power against time already lost. The healer, an elderly woman with gentle eyes and hands worn from decades of tending the wounded and weak, watched him quietly for several moments before stepping closer. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm but kind, and told him that forgiveness was not something to be demanded from the dying. It had to rise freely from a heart willing to release its hurt. She explained in a calm, steady tone that Mama Nena's spirit rested at a crossroads, torn between the world she knew and the ancestors who whispered from beyond. Love alone could call her back, but only if her heart chose to answer. Darasimi nodded desperately, his breath catching as he looked again at his mother's still form. He lowered his forehead to her hand, tears spilling from him with a grief too heavy to shape into words. His thoughts spiraled through memories, her laughter echoing through their old compound, her patient voice guiding him through childhood mistakes, her tireless strength as she worked under the sun to keep him fed and educated. Every memory cut deeper than the last, reminding him of the love he had betrayed in his pursuit of status. He begged her to stay, promised to make everything right, to return home, to live in a way that honored the sacrifices she made for him. But the hut remained silent, except for her labored breathing and the soft crackle of burning herbs nearby. He clung to her hand, as though willing his warmth into her cooling fingers, whispering prayers he had forgotten how to say. The world outside the hut faded until there was nothing but the fragile sound of his mother's breath and the pounding of his own regret-filled heartbeat. He waited for any sign, any flicker, any whisper, any movement that told him she still heard him, still felt him, still wanted to hold on to the life they once shared. The healer watched quietly, knowing this moment belonged to them alone. She stepped back, allowing the air around them to settle into an aching stillness, the kind that stretched time into something unrecognizable. Darasimi leaned closer, brushing his thumb along his mother's palm, his voice soft and trembling as he begged once more, not for forgiveness, but for another chance to show her the love he should have never withheld. And then, just as the lantern's flame flickered dangerously low, Mama Nena's eyelids quivered, lifting only slightly as though pulled by an unseen force. But instead of relief, a new terror tightened in his chest, for her expression remained unreadable, suspended somewhere between this world and the next. In that fragile silence, Darasimi realized her next breath would decide everything. Her voice rose from the thin border between life and eternity, gentle but sharp enough to slice through every illusion he had wrapped around himself. It was the kind of voice that carried both love and consequence, trembling with truth that could not be softened by tears. And as he leaned closer, he knew that whatever she said next would live forever in the deepest chambers of his memory. Mama Nena's eyes fluttered open with the struggle of someone fighting to return from a place far beyond human reach, and for a long moment, she simply looked at him. Her gaze, though clouded by exhaustion, held a clarity that made Darasimi's breath falter. It was as though she saw not the man kneeling beside her, but the child he once was. The child who clung to her wrapper, who believed the world began and ended in her embrace. Her lips trembled slightly before any sound emerged, and when her voice finally rose, it did so with the fragile echo of someone holding tightly to their last reserve of strength. She called his name softly, and, hearing it spoken with such tenderness, unraveled something deep within him. Her words came slowly, each syllable delicate and measured, as though she had gathered every ounce of breath she had left to shape them. She told him she had forgiven him long before he even knew he needed forgiveness, that a mother's heart did not wait for apologies to release love. Yet she also warned him that forgiveness never erased consequence. Choices, she said, carved their own paths through a person's life, and whether he walked in pride or humility determined whether those paths led toward peace or destruction. Darasimi's tears fell freely now, sliding down his cheeks and landing on her frail fingers. She brushed her thumb weakly across the back of his hand, a gesture so small, yet so piercing it splintered his heart all over again. She spoke of nights spent praying for him, of dawns where she whispered his name into the silence, hoping the wind would carry her voice to wherever he had wandered. She confessed that her suffering was not from poverty alone, but from the quiet wounds of being forgotten by the child she loved more than breath. Her sorrow, she told him, stretched deeper than even she realized, because a mother's heart could break without ever losing its desire to give. Her voice wavered as she reminded him that humility was not weakness, but strength, that pride might make a man appear tall, but only humility allowed him to stand firmly on ground that would not shift beneath him. She urged him to rebuild his life, not as the man who fled from his origins, but as the son who understood the value of the dignity of and the sacredness. She asked him to honor her by choosing her. Eyelids fluttered only once more, her breath settling into a slow, fading rhythm that told him she was slipping away. And as her hand finally slipped from his grasp, the truth struck him with chilling clarity. This moment could never be undone, no matter how deep his regret or how loudly his heart cried out. The silence that followed felt heavier than grief, as though the world itself paused to acknowledge the weight of what he had lost. And in that stillness, he realized his life had just changed forever. Grief settled on his shoulders with a weight far heavier than the poverty he once feared, pressing into every breath until even the air felt too sharp to hold. It was the kind of sorrow that hollowed a man from the inside, leaving him wandering through memories he could no longer escape. And as he stepped into the village morning, he realized that loss had a way of reshaping a person more completely than any ambition ever could. The village awakened slowly around him, but Darasimi walked through its familiar paths as though drifting in a world apart, his steps unsteady beneath the storm of emotion raging silently inside him. The people who had known him since boyhood watched him with expressions neither hostile nor warm. Some stared with softened pity, as though recognizing a man who had finally returned to the truth he had run from for too long. Others carried quiet judgment in their eyes, not born from cruelty, but from a deep understanding of consequences that life itself had woven into the very soil they walked upon. They did not speak as he passed. The weight of his grief had already silenced any questions they might have asked. The air was heavy with the scent of early morning dew as Darasimi approached the small clearing where his mother had been laid to rest, her grave marked by freshly turned soil and a simple wooden marker bearing her name. He paused at its edge, feeling his legs tremble beneath him, not from exhaustion, but from the ache swelling within his chest. Slowly, he sank to his knees, the earth cool beneath him, grounding him in the reality he wished he could undo. He rested his palms on the soil, letting the texture slip between his fingers as though reaching for the warmth of her hands one last time. Memories flooded him with the quiet force of a river breaking through a cracked dam. He remembered her laughter as she prepared meals in the small hut, her strength as she carried baskets of vegetables to the market, her gentle voice guiding him through childhood fears. He remembered how she stood beneath the scorching sun just to earn enough to feed him, how she folded hope into every prayer she whispered, how she waited year after year for the son she believed would one day return with gratitude. He had tried so hard to bury these memories beneath layers of ambition, pretending they belonged to a version of himself he no longer wanted to acknowledge. But kneeling here, surrounded by the echoes of her sacrifices, he realized that these memories were not chains. They were the very foundation he had abandoned. He whispered her name, the word trembling as it left his lips, and the sound cracked something inside him. He bowed his head, tears soaking into the soil that now held her, wishing with every fiber of his being that he could trade his success, his pride, even his future, for just one more moment with her. But the quiet of the grave offered no comfort, only the stillness of a life completed. He traced the wooden marker gently, as though touching her face, and felt his heart contract with a sharpness he had never known in the city, an ache born from the realization that he had returned too late. As the sun crept higher, casting soft gold across the clearing, Darasimi inhaled deeply, letting the air fill him with a purpose he had not yet shaped. He knew, with a clarity forged from pain, that he would never again chase a life that cost him his soul. He vowed to build something truer, something rooted in humility and memory, not in the fragile scaffolding of pride. The vow rose from him not as a dramatic declaration, but as a quiet promise to the woman who had carried him long before he carried ambition on his shoulders. He remained at her graveside for a long time, allowing the morning to stretch into afternoon, his thoughts drifting between regret and resolve. Eventually he stood, feeling older, steadier, and strangely lighter, as though the ground beneath him had taken some of his grief in exchange for a hint of direction. He walked back toward the village with a slow, reflective calm, no longer trying to outrun his mistakes, but preparing to confront them with humility. The villagers noticed the shift in his posture, the new stillness in his eyes, the quiet determination that had replaced the restless ambition he once wore so proudly. Before twilight settled, whispers began circulating through the village that Darasimi had taken an irreversible vow, one that would bind him not to the city he once cherished, but to a path far more demanding. The rumor spread like a soft breeze, stirring curiosity and uncertainty in equal measure. And as night rose over the village, no one knew what the vow truly meant, or what it would cost him next. His wealth had failed him in every way that mattered. But in the stillness of grief, he found a truth his ambition had long overshadowed. Humility could rebuild places pride had burned to ashes. Redemption did not arrive in grand gestures, but in the quiet labor of beginning again, piece by fragile piece. And as he stepped into the life he once fled, he discovered that healing sometimes lived in the very places we fear returning to. Darasimi's return to the village was nothing like the triumphant homecomings he once imagined during his rise in Lagos. There were no cheers, no celebrations, no proud announcements of success. Instead, there was the soft crunch of dry soil beneath his feet and the quiet presence of neighbors who watched him with a mixture of curiosity and acceptance. He had come back not as a man seeking applause, but as a son, carrying the remnants of a broken past. His first act was to sell what little remained of his city possessions, stripping away the last threads of the identity he had once clung to so desperately. The decision felt both painful and liberating, as though he were peeling away a second skin to reveal the truth beneath. With the money he gathered, he began the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding his mother's hut. Each day he rose before dawn, gathering clay, smoothing walls, and crafting the structure with the same care she once used to shape his childhood. The process demanded patience and resolve, but with every handful of earth pressed into place, he felt himself piecing together more than a home. He was restoring the part of himself that had learned to love before it learned to fear poverty. The villagers watched silently at first, but gradually they joined him, offering guidance, tools, and the type of support that lived quietly in communities bound by shared histories. When the hut finally stood complete, warm and welcoming under the sun, Darasimi felt an ache of both victory and loss. He knew she would never walk through its doorway again, never sit outside under the evening breeze, never call his name in that tender tone that had shaped his earliest days. But he also knew she would have been proud, not of the structure itself, but of the heart behind its creation. In her memory, he extended his hands beyond his personal grief, choosing to invest in the children of the village. He sponsored school fees, purchased books, and spent long afternoons teaching them lessons he had learned through painful mistakes. He wanted them to see pathways he never recognized, to understand that ambition did not need to sever one's roots to flourish. The more he gave, the more he found himself healing in ways he did not expect. His days filled with honest labor, the hum of children learning nearby, and the quiet reflection that settled over him each time he sat outside the rebuilt hut. At night he often whispered apologies to the wind, hoping they would find their way to his mother's spirit. The sorrow of her loss never vanished, but its edges softened, reshaped by the knowledge that he was finally becoming the man she had prayed he would be, steadfast, humble, grounded in truth. Through seasons of planting and harvest, village celebrations and silent evenings, Darasimi earned a quiet respect that no amount of wealth could ever purchase. The villagers saw the transformation not in his words, but in his actions, in the steadiness of his presence, the sincerity of his service, and the humility that now shaped each step he took. He learned to walk with reverence for the land that raised him, finding peace not in accomplishments, but in belonging. And in the rhythms of village life, he discovered a form of triumph that the city had never been able to offer him. But as the years settled gently around him, fate, patient, unyielding, always watching, prepared to shift once more. One afternoon, as he sat outside the hut with a calm he had finally learned to cherish, a stranger approached with a sealed letter marked by the emblem of a Lagos firm. The sight of it tightened something deep in his chest, stirring a past he thought he had closed forever. And before he even broke the seal, he sensed that peace had only been a temporary visitor. If this story touched your heart, stay with us on this journey of powerful lessons and unforgettable emotions. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice brings these stories to life in ways only true listeners can. Subscribe and join our growing family, where every tale carries a truth worth remembering. Let the next chapter find you here, ready to listen, ready to feel, ready to reflect. Your support is the fire that keeps these stories alive.